The morning fog rolled thick across the James River in the spring of 1619, shrouding the newly established settlement of Jamestown in an eerie silence that seemed to press against the wooden palisades like an unwelcome visitor. The air carried the scent of pine smoke and damp earth, mingling with the acrid smell of human sweat and desperation that had become the colony's signature perfume. In the dim light of dawn, a young woman named Abeni moved quietly through the tobacco fields, her dark hands working the soil with practiced efficiency, despite the iron shackles that marked her as property of Master Richard Whitmore. Abeni had been torn from her homeland on the western coast of Africa nearly 2 years prior, surviving the horrific Middle Passage crammed in the belly of a slave ship called the White Lion. She had watched 37 of her fellow captives perish during that nightmare voyage, their bodies thrown overboard like discarded cargo. The memories still haunted her dreams, waking her in the dead of night with silent screams trapped in her throat. But Abeni possessed something her captors could never take from her, a fierce determination to survive, to remember who she had been before the chains, before the brand on her shoulder that declared her Master Whitmore's possession. The Virginia colony, in these early years, was a powder keg of competing tensions. The English settlers, having barely survived the starving time of 1609–1610, were desperate to make their venture profitable. Tobacco had become their salvation, the golden leaf that John Rolfe had successfully cultivated, turning the struggling outpost into a potentially lucrative enterprise. But success required labor, backbreaking labor under the merciless Virginia sun, and the colony's solution was the systematic importation of African slaves, human beings reduced to commodities in ledger books. Master Whitmore was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition. Standing well over 6 feet tall with a gaunt frame that suggested a perpetual hunger, not for food but for power, he ruled his small plantation with an iron fist wrapped in religious righteousness. His grey eyes held no warmth, only calculation, and his thin lips rarely formed anything resembling a smile. He had arrived in Virginia 5 years earlier with nothing but his name and his faith, convinced that God had ordained him for greatness in this new world. The acquisition of Abeni and 3 other enslaved Africans had represented his entry into the planter class, a status he guarded jealously. "You there? Move faster," barked John Kempe, the overseer whose red face perpetually glistened with sweat and whose breath reeked of cheap rum. Kempe was a failed indentured servant who had worked off his debt and now channeled his own past humiliation into tormenting those beneath him on the social ladder. He cracked his whip near Abeni's feet, the sound splitting the morning air like a gunshot. "Master wants this section cleared by midday, and I'll see you whipped raw if it ain't done." Abeni did not look up, did not acknowledge the threat. She had learned in her first weeks that eye contact was interpreted as defiance, and defiance brought the lash. Instead, she simply worked faster, her fingers pulling weeds from around the young tobacco plants with methodical precision. Beside her, an older slave named Samuel, who had been in the colony for nearly a decade, whispered without moving his lips, a skill all the enslaved had perfected. "He's in a foul mood today. Master had words with Governor Yeardley yesterday about land patents. Didn't go well, I hear." Abeni gave the slightest nod. Samuel had become something of a father figure to her, teaching her the English words she needed to survive, explaining the incomprehensible rules and customs of this alien world. He had also warned her about the growing tensions in the colony, the way the English settlers looked for scapegoats whenever disease struck, or crops failed, or Indian raids threatened their precarious foothold. The Whitmore plantation sat on a bend of the river, about 8 miles from Jamestown proper, comprising roughly 200 acres of cleared land and another 300 of dense forest. The main house was a modest 2-story structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney surrounded by smaller outbuildings, a tobacco barn, a smokehouse, and the single cramped cabin where Abeni and the other enslaved people slept on dirt floors. The settlement was bordered on three sides by wilderness where the Powhatan people still moved freely, a constant reminder that the English claim to this land was both recent and contested. As the morning sun burned away the fog, revealing a sky of crystalline blue, Abeni felt the familiar ache in her back intensify. She had been working since before dawn, as she did every day, with only cornmeal mush for breakfast and the promise of the same for supper. Her dress, a rough sackcloth garment that hung loosely on her diminishing frame, was soaked through with sweat. But she kept working, kept her head down, kept surviving. It was near midday when she heard the commotion from the direction of the main house, raised voices, the sharp sound of breaking pottery, and then a woman's scream that cut through the humid air like a blade. Abeni paused, her hands stilling in the soil. Beside her, Samuel tensed. "Mistress Catherine," he muttered. "Sounds like trouble." Catherine Whitmore was Master Richard's wife, a woman of 23 who had arrived from England just 6 months earlier as part of an arranged marriage designed to secure her family's investment in Virginia tobacco. She was pale and perpetually ill, unsuited to the harsh realities of colonial life, and her disposition had grown increasingly erratic as the months wore on. The other slaves whispered that she was haunted, that the ghost of her first child, stillborn just 2 months after her arrival, followed her through the house at night. Kempe came running from the main house, his face even redder than usual, his eyes wild with something that looked like fear mixed with opportunity. He grabbed Abeni by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. "You, girl, you're wanted at the house, now." Abeni's heart hammered in her chest. Being summoned to the main house was never good. She glanced at Samuel, whose weathered face had gone ashen, then allowed herself to be dragged toward the structure that loomed like a gallows in the midday sun. As they approached, she could see Master Whitmore standing on the porch, his tall frame rigid with fury. Beside him stood Mistress Catherine, her pale hair dishevelled, her eyes red from crying, and her hands trembling as she clutched something to her chest. "Is this the one?" Master Whitmore's voice was cold, controlled, more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Yes, Master," Kemp replied, forcing Abeni to her knees on the hard-packed earth. "This is the African wench." Abeni kept her eyes on the ground, her mind racing. What had she done? What had she failed to do? The rules were so numerous, so arbitrary, that it was impossible not to break them occasionally. But this felt different. The air was charged with something worse than the usual cruelty. Mistress Catherine stepped forward, and Abeni could see her feet in their fine leather shoes, so incongruous with the rough surroundings. When the mistress spoke, her voice was high and hysterical, each word laced with accusation. "She has cursed me. I know it was her. Look at this." Catherine thrust something forward, and Master Whitmore took it from her hands, examining it with narrowed eyes. "Where did you find this?" he asked his wife. "Beneath my pillow, beneath my very pillow where I lay my head each night. She put it there, I know she did. She has been in my chamber, touching my things, and now she seeks to harm me with her heathen magic." Abeni risked a glance upward and saw what Master Whitmore held, a small bundle of twigs and dried herbs tied with a strip of cloth. Her blood ran cold. She recognized it immediately, not because she had made it, but because she had seen Samuel crafting similar bundles, small tokens from his own African traditions that he kept hidden, that gave him a small measure of comfort in this hostile land. But this one was not his, and it was certainly not hers. "I did not," Abeni began, but Kempe's fist struck her across the face, splitting her lip and sending her sprawling in the dirt. "Silence, witch," he spat. "You'll speak when spoken to." Master Whitmore descended the steps slowly, his boots thudding with each measured step. He stood over Abeni, and she could feel his gaze like a physical weight. When he spoke, his words were deliberate, each one a nail being driven into her coffin. Witchcraft is an abomination before God. In England, those who traffic with the devil are put to death, and Virginia shall be no different. We are building a godly society here, and we cannot allow such evil to take root among us. But, Master, I have done nothing, Abeni managed to say through her bleeding lip, the words thick and desperate. I do not know of this thing. I have never seen it before. Lies! Catherine shrieked from the porch. She lies as all witches lie. She has been watching me, studying me, waiting for her chance to destroy me. I have felt her evil eye upon me for weeks now. Reverend Josiah Blackwood emerged from inside the house, drawn by the commotion. The colony's minister was a man of 40 years, lean and ascetic, with dark eyes that burned with the fervor of absolute certainty. He had come to Virginia not for profit, but for souls, determined to bring Protestant righteousness to the wilderness. He took the bundle from Master Whitmore and examined it with the careful attention of a scholar, turning it over in his long fingers. These are the implements of dark arts, Blackwood pronounced, his voice carrying the weight of religious authority. Herbs and binding, arranged in patterns I have seen described in texts about African paganism. This is idolatry at best, devil worship at worst. Then you agree she must be punished? Master Whitmore asked, though his tone suggested the answer was foregone. The Bible is clear on this matter. Exodus 22, verse 18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. If we allow such practices to flourish, we invite God's wrath upon this entire colony. The Reverend's pronouncement fell like a sentence of death. Abeni felt the world tilting beneath her. This could not be happening. She had survived the slave ships, survived the brutality of plantation life, survived by making herself invisible, by never causing trouble, by simply enduring. And now she was being accused of something she had not done, condemned by an object she had never touched. Please, she said, and she hated the desperation in her voice, hated that she had to beg these people who had stolen her life. Please, I am no witch. I am Christian. I have learned your prayers. I have listened to the Reverend's sermons on Sundays. I do not practice magic. The devil's greatest trick is to appear godly, Blackwood replied coldly. Your kind brings darkness from Africa, ancient evils that we must purge if we are to build a righteous society here. Master Whitmore looked down at Abeni with an expression that might have been satisfaction, might have been relief at having found an outlet for his own frustrated ambitions and fears. He nodded to Kempe. Lock her in the smokehouse. We will convene the other planters and determine proper punishment. But make no mistake, girl, you will pay for this transgression against my household and against God. As Kempe hauled her to her feet and dragged her toward the smokehouse, Abeni caught Samuel's eye across the field. The old man's face was stricken with horror and helplessness. She wanted to tell him not to speak up, not to defend her, because she knew any attempt to help would only result in his own destruction. The system was designed to crush them completely, to make their lives so precarious that solidarity became impossible. The smokehouse was a small log structure with a dirt floor and no windows, used to cure meat during butchering season. Now, it would serve as her cell. Kempe shoved her inside and secured the door with a heavy wooden bar. The darkness was absolute, broken only by thin lines of light between the logs. The air was thick with the lingering smell of smoke and dried blood. Abeni sank to the floor, her body finally giving in to the shaking she had suppressed. Tears came then, hot and bitter, tears for her lost homeland, for her family whom she would never see again, for the life that had been stolen from her and now would be taken completely. She knew what happened to those accused of witchcraft. She had heard stories from Samuel about witch trials in New England, about women hanged or pressed to death under stones. And she knew that here, where she was not even fully human in the eyes of the law, where she was property to be disposed of, there would be no real trial, no real chance for justice. Outside, she could hear voices, the murmur of conversation, as word spread through the small plantation community. She heard Kemp speaking to someone, his voice carrying clearly through the log walls. Master's wife has been poorly for months now. Losing that baby near drove her mad. She needs someone to blame, and that African girl's as good as any. Besides, the other planters have been nervous about keeping so many slaves without proper controls. This'll send a message. The other voice, which Abeni recognized as belonging to Thomas Wade, another white laborer, responded with barely concealed glee. Reckon they'll burn her. I heard tell that's what they do to witches in the old country. Likely. Master Whitmore's got a reputation to maintain. Can't have folk thinking he's soft on devil worship. Bad for business, bad for standing in the colony. Abeni pressed her hands against her mouth to stifle a sob. They were discussing her death as casually as they might discuss the weather or the tobacco harvest. She was not a person to them, merely a problem to be eliminated, a warning to be made visible. As the afternoon wore on and the heat in the smokehouse became oppressive, Abeni's thoughts turned to her mother, whom she had last seen on the beach in Africa, as slave traders forced her into a canoe that would take her to the waiting ship. Her mother had called out her name, had screamed it until her voice broke, and Abeni had promised herself she would survive, that she would honor her mother's memory by refusing to let them destroy her spirit, even if they owned her body. But now, in this dark prison waiting for an unjust death, she wondered if survival was enough. She had survived, yes, but at what cost? She had become less than herself, had learned to hide every part of her true nature, had suppressed her language, her beliefs, her very identity to avoid giving them any excuse to hurt her. And still, it had not been enough. They would kill her anyway, would burn her as a witch, because it was convenient, because it served their purposes, because her life had never mattered to them at all. The sound of horses approaching broke through her dark thoughts. Through the gaps in the logs, she could see riders arriving, other planters from neighboring properties. Master Whitmore was assembling his jury, men who would decide her fate based not on evidence, but on expedience and fear. She recognized Robert Fielding, whose plantation was 5 miles downriver, and James Hartwell, who served on the colonial council. These were men of standing, men who shaped the laws and customs of Virginia, and not one of them would see her as anything other than dangerous property. As evening approached, the door to the smokehouse was pulled open, and rough hands dragged her out into the fading light. A group of about 12 white men had gathered near the main house, some sitting on horses, others standing in a loose semicircle. Master Whitmore stood at the center, flanked by Reverend Blackwood, who held a Bible prominently in his hands as if it were both shield and weapon. "Bring the accused forward," Whitmore commanded, and Kempe forced Abeni to stand before this assembly of her judges. Robert Fielding, a corpulent man whose red face spoke of too much wine and too little physical labor, leaned forward in his saddle. "This is the slave accused of witchcraft?" "She is," Whitmore confirmed, "found in possession of charms and accused by my wife of placing curses upon our household." "What say you, girl?" Fielding asked, though his tone suggested her answer mattered not at all. Abeni lifted her head, meeting his gaze despite knowing it was dangerous. If she was to die, she would die with whatever dignity she could salvage. "I am innocent. I have done nothing wrong. I do not practice witchcraft. The object found was not mine, and I do not know how it came to be where it was discovered. The testimony of a slave holds no weight against that of a Christian woman," Reverend Blackwood interjected immediately, "especially one already tainted by association with pagan practices. Her very presence here, her African origins, make her suspect." James Hartwell, a thin man with calculating eyes, spoke up. "The real question, gentlemen, is not whether she is guilty, for that seems clear enough, but what punishment best serves the colony's interests. We have growing numbers of these African slaves arriving, and we must establish clear precedents about what will not be tolerated." "Agreed," said another planter, whose name Abeni did not know. "The Indians watch us constantly, looking for signs of weakness. The slaves must know that any hint of rebellion or supernatural mischief will be met with the harshest punishment. While you are watching this unfold, consider subscribing to our channel to discover more hidden stories from America's darkest chapters." Master Whitmore nodded slowly, clearly pleased with the direction of the conversation. "Then we are in agreement. The punishment should be death." A murmur of assent passed through the assembled men. Not one voice rose in dissent, not one question was asked about evidence or proper procedure. The decision had been made before she was even brought before them. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, opening his Bible to a marked page. "In the book of Deuteronomy, the Lord commands us to purge evil from among us. This woman has brought African darkness to our Christian settlement, and we must cleanse ourselves of her influence. I propose death by burning, as is traditional for witches, so that her body and her evil may be consumed by purifying fire." "Burning," Whitmore repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, that seems fitting. It will serve as a powerful deterrent to others who might harbor similar inclinations." Abeni felt her legs weakening beneath her. Burning. They were going to burn her alive. She had heard of such deaths, the unimaginable agony, the slow torture of flames consuming flesh. Her breath came in short gasps as panic threatened to overwhelm her completely. "When?" asked Fielding. "Tomorrow at dawn," Whitmore replied. "We will erect a stake near the tobacco barn where all can witness. Every slave, every servant, every free person in the area will be required to attend. Let them see what happens to those who deal with the devil." The sentence had been pronounced. There would be no appeal, no reprieve, no escape. Abeni was dragged back to the smokehouse, her legs barely functioning, her mind reeling with terror and disbelief. As the door slammed shut again, plunging her back into darkness, she finally allowed herself to scream, a sound of such anguish and rage that it seemed to shake the very walls of her prison. Through the night, she heard the sounds of preparation, the hammering of nails as they constructed the instrument of her death, the murmur of voices discussing logistics as if they were planning a harvest festival rather than a murder. She heard Mistress Catherine's laughter at one point, high and brittle, and realized that the woman was genuinely excited, that Abeni's death would somehow validate her paranoia and give meaning to her own misery. Samuel came near midnight, managing to slip close to the smokehouse without being observed. "Abeni," he whispered through the logs. "Child, I am so sorry. I have tried to think of some way to help you, but there is none. They are determined." "I know," she replied, her voice hoarse from crying. "Samuel, you must tell them, tell anyone who will listen in the years to come, that I was innocent, that I died for nothing, killed by lies and fear." "I will remember," the old man promised. "And I will make sure others remember too. Your name will not be forgotten." "My name," Abeni repeated softly. In all the months she had been in Virginia, none of the white people had ever asked her name, had ever called her anything but girl or wench or that African. Even now, in condemning her to death, they had not bothered to learn it. "I am Abeni, daughter of Amara, born free under the wide sky of my homeland. I am not a witch. I am not evil. I am simply a woman who wanted to live." The first light of dawn broke over the Virginia wilderness with a beauty that seemed obscene given what it would illuminate. The sky turned from black to deep purple to shades of pink and gold. Birds began their morning songs, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the tobacco plants. It was the kind of morning that promised warmth and possibility, that spoke of new beginnings rather than endings. Abeni had not slept. How could she? Each hour that passed brought her closer to an unspeakable death, and her mind had tortured her through the night with vivid imaginings of what was to come. She had prayed, first to the Christian God they had forced upon her, then to the spirits of her ancestors, then simply to any force in the universe that might hear her desperate pleas. But the night had remained silent, offering no comfort, no miraculous reprieve. When Kempe opened the smokehouse door, the morning light seemed harsh, blinding after hours in darkness. He grabbed her arm without ceremony and pulled her out. She could barely stand, her legs weak from confinement and terror, but he showed no sympathy, simply dragging her forward when she stumbled. The scene that greeted her was surreal in its horrible efficiency. Near the tobacco barn, they had erected a wooden stake about 8 feet tall, sunk deep into the earth. Around its base, they had piled kindling and logs, carefully arranged to ensure a hot, sustained fire. The stake itself had iron rings attached at various heights, clearly intended to secure the victim in place. Abeni's stomach heaved at the sight, but she had nothing to vomit, having been given no food since her arrest. The plantation's entire population had been assembled as ordered. The 4 enslaved Africans stood in a separate group, their faces masks of suppressed horror. Samuel looked as if he had aged 10 years overnight, his shoulders slumped under a weight of grief and helplessness. The white servants and laborers formed another cluster, their expressions ranging from grim satisfaction to uncomfortable curiosity. And arrayed on the porch of the main house were the planters and their families, including several women and even a few children, all gathered to witness what was deemed righteous punishment. Master Whitmore stood near the stake, dressed in his finest clothes, as if this were a formal occasion. Beside him, Reverend Blackwood clutched his Bible, his face set in lines of stern righteousness. Mistress Catherine was also present, looking pale but triumphant, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to her nose as if the very air around Abeni was contaminated. "Bring her forward," Whitmore commanded, and Kemp obeyed, forcing Abeni toward the stake. Her legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed to her knees in the dirt. The overseer cursed and hauled her upright, pushing her back against the wooden pole. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, opening his Bible with deliberate ceremony. His voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to every person assembled. "We are gathered here in the sight of God to execute justice upon one who has turned from the light and embraced darkness. This woman, this African slave, has been found guilty of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with evil spirits, and of bringing curses upon a Christian household. The Lord's word is clear on such matters. In Exodus we read, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.' In Deuteronomy we are commanded to purge evil from among us. Today we fulfill God's will." Abeni wanted to protest, wanted to scream her innocence one more time, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She could only stare at the assembled faces, searching for any sign of doubt, any hint that someone might question this atrocity. But she found nothing. The white faces showed only approval or indifference, while the black faces showed only the terrible recognition that any of them could be next, that their lives hung by equally thin threads. 2 men, laborers she recognized, but whose name she had never learned, began binding her to the stake. They used rough hemp rope, wrapping it around her body at the chest, waist, and legs, pulling it tight enough to restrict her breathing. When they secured her wrists behind the pole, she felt the rope bite into her skin, drawing blood. The physical pain was nothing compared to the soul-crushing horror of what was about to happen. "Have you any final words?" Whitmore asked, the question a formality devoid of genuine interest. Abeni found her voice then, pulling it from somewhere deep within, some reserve of strength she did not know she possessed. When she spoke, her words were clear and strong, and she addressed not her executioners, but the other slaves, the people who would remember. "I am innocent. I have done nothing wrong. They kill me not for witchcraft, but because they fear what they cannot control, because they need someone to blame for their own failures and fears. My blood will stain this land, and it will cry out forever against this injustice. Remember me. Remember that I was human, that I had a name, that I deserved to live." "Enough," Whitmore snapped, nodding to Kempe. "Light the fire." Kempe took a torch that had been burning in a brazier and approached the pyre. Abeni's breathing became rapid, shallow, panic threatening to shatter her completely. She pulled against the ropes, a futile gesture that only tightened them further. She could see Samuel weeping openly, could see the other slaves looking away, unable to bear witness. The overseer touched the torch to the kindling at multiple points, and the dry wood caught immediately. Flames began to lick upward, crackling and popping, releasing smoke that stung Abeni's eyes and throat. The heat was intense, even before the fire fully caught, and she knew that within moments it would become unbearable. But then something unexpected happened. Thomas Wade, the white laborer who had spoken so callously about her death the day before, suddenly stepped forward from the crowd. "Wait!" he called out, his voice uncertain but audible. "Wait! I need to speak!" Master Whitmore turned, his face darkening with anger at the interruption. "What is the meaning of this? We are engaged in lawful execution." Wade removed his cap, wringing it in his hands, clearly terrified but driven by some internal compulsion. "Master Whitmore, Reverend, I cannot stay silent. That bundle, the one found under Mistress Catherine's pillow, I know how it got there." A shocked murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. The flames continued to grow, but Kempe paused, looking uncertainly at his master. Abeni, through her terror, felt a wild surge of hope. "Explain yourself immediately," Whitmore demanded, striding toward Wade with barely contained fury. The laborer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It was Jenny, sir. Jenny Marsh, the English servant girl who works in your house. I saw her with that bundle 3 days ago. She was hiding it in her apron, and when I asked what it was, she said it was just herbs for cooking. But then yesterday, when all this started, I realized I think she's the one who put it there." "Lies!" Mistress Catherine shrieked from the porch. "He lies to save the witch. Jenny has been with our household for a year. She is a good Christian girl." "Is she here?" Reverend Blackwood asked, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Where is Jenny Marsh?" A terrible silence fell as people looked around and realized that the servant girl in question was nowhere to be seen. One of the other house servants, a woman named Mary, spoke up hesitantly. "She ran off early this morning, Reverend, said she was feeling poorly and needed to visit her sister in Jamestown, but now that I think on it, she seemed frightened, not ill." Master Whitmore's face had gone from red to purple. He turned to Kempe, who still held the burning torch. "Extinguish that fire, now." The overseer and several other men rushed to throw dirt on the flames, which were still small enough to control. Within moments, the fire was reduced to smouldering embers, though the heat remained intense near the stake. Abeni sagged against the ropes, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Whitmore turned to Wade, grabbing him by the shirt front. "Tell me everything. Leave out no detail." The laborer spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "Jenny has been acting strange for weeks, sir, ever since Mistress Catherine lost the baby. I heard her muttering to herself about how the mistress blamed her for not attending properly during the birth. And I know she's been sweet on John Kempe here, but he spurned her advances. She's been angry, vengeful even. I didn't think much of it until now. But looking back, I think she meant to cause trouble, to point blame at the African girl who couldn't defend herself." Reverend Blackwood's expression had shifted from certainty to doubt. "A false accusation. If true, this is a grave sin indeed. We nearly executed an innocent woman based on manufactured evidence." "We must find Jenny Marsh immediately," Whitmore ordered, snapping commands to several of his men. "Send riders to Jamestown. Search every house if necessary. If what Wade says is true, she will face the consequences of her deceit." Kempe finally moved to untie Abeni from the stake, his hands fumbling with the ropes. When she was released, she collapsed to the ground, her legs unable to support her. The ropes had left deep marks in her flesh, and the heat from the fire had singed her clothing. But she was alive. Against all odds, impossibly, she was alive. Samuel rushed to her side, helping her to sit up, cradling her head against his shoulder as she began to shake uncontrollably. The delayed reaction to her near death was hitting her now, and she could not stop trembling. Master Whitmore stood before her, and for a moment she thought he might apologize, might acknowledge the monstrous injustice he had nearly committed. But his words, when they came, were concerned only with his own reputation. "You will speak of this to no one. If word spreads that we nearly executed the wrong person, it will reflect poorly on this household and on the administration of justice in this colony. Do you understand?" Abeni could not bring herself to respond. The man had been prepared to burn her alive based on nothing, and now he was worried about gossip. Samuel answered for her, his voice thick with barely suppressed rage. "She understands, Master." The assembled crowd began to disperse, some disappointed at being denied their spectacle, others clearly shaken by how close they had come to witnessing an innocent woman's murder. The planters returned to their horses, discussing the matter in low voices, already spinning narratives that would absolve them of any wrongdoing. Over the next 3 days, while Abeni recovered in the slave cabin, unable to work due to the trauma and the rope burns, the story of Jenny Marsh unfolded. The girl had been found hiding in a tavern in Jamestown, and under questioning by colonial authorities, she had broken down and confessed everything. She had indeed crafted the bundle of herbs and twigs, using knowledge gained from an old woman in her village in England who had practiced folk magic. Her intention had been to cast suspicion on Abeni, whom she had resented for receiving attention from Kempe, the overseer. But what Jenny had not understood, or perhaps had understood all too well, was the precarious position of enslaved Africans in the colony. An accusation that might have resulted in a whipping or public shaming for a white servant became a death sentence for a slave. Jenny's jealousy and spite had nearly cost Abeni her life, and the fact that it had almost succeeded revealed the true horror of the system. Jenny Marsh was sentenced to 30 lashes and 2 additional years of indentured servitude as punishment for her false accusation. In the eyes of colonial law, attempting to cause the death of a slave was not considered attempted murder, merely destruction of property and bearing false witness. The disparity in punishment spoke volumes about who was considered fully human under Virginia law. During her recovery, Abeni received an unexpected visitor. Mistress Catherine appeared at the slave cabin door one afternoon, unaccompanied by any overseer or servant, which was highly unusual. She stood in the doorway, her pale hands twisted together, her eyes unable to meet Abeni's gaze. "I wanted to see how you were healing," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. Abeni, sitting on the floor because there was no furniture in the cabin, did not respond immediately. What could she say to this woman who had been so eager to see her burned alive? Catherine took a hesitant step inside. "I was wrong. I was so lost in my own grief and fears that I let myself believe what I wanted to believe. I convinced myself you were responsible for my misfortunes because it was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason, that we have no control. You almost had me killed," Abeni said flatly, finding her voice. "You wanted me dead." "I know." Tears began to stream down Catherine's face. "I know, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. I cannot undo what I did, cannot take back those accusations, but I want you to know that I am sorry, truly deeply sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, inadequate and yet somehow necessary. Abeni studied the white woman's face and saw genuine remorse there, but also the recognition that this remorse changed nothing about their relative positions. Catherine would go back to the main house, to her comfortable life, while Abeni would remain enslaved, her life still hanging by a thread that could be cut at any moment. "Your sorrow does not change what I am here," Abeni finally said. "I am still property. My life still matters less than your convenience. Tomorrow or next month or next year, something else might happen, and I could face the same fate. Your guilt does nothing to protect me." Catherine nodded slowly, accepting the truth of these words. She reached into her apron and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is money. Not much, but it is mine, not my husband's. I want you to have it. Perhaps someday, somehow, it might help you purchase your freedom or—" She trailed off, perhaps realizing how absurd the gesture was. What good was a small amount of coin to someone who was legally forbidden from owning property, who could be sold or killed at a master's whim? But Abeni took the pouch anyway, tucking it into her clothing. Not because she believed it would save her, but because it was a tangible acknowledgement of the wrong done to her, a small piece of evidence that someone had seen her as human, even if too late. After Catherine left, Samuel sat with Abeni in the gathering twilight. The old man had barely left her side since her ordeal, watching over her with a fierce protectiveness that reminded her painfully of her own father. "What you said to her, about your life still not mattering, that was true," Samuel said quietly. "This system is designed to break us, to make us less than human, but you survived, child. Against all odds, you survived. And that matters." "Does it?" Abeni asked, her voice hollow. "I am still here, still enslaved, still subject to the whims of people who see me as an animal. What have I survived for?" Samuel took her hand in his weathered ones. "You survived to bear witness, to tell the truth about what happened here. Most slaves die without anyone knowing their names, their stories, but you will be remembered. What almost happened to you, it shows the truth of this place, the evil at its foundation. That truth needs to be told." "Who would listen?" Abeni whispered. "Who cares about the suffering of slaves?" "Maybe no one now," Samuel admitted, "but someday, child. Someday people will look back at this time, and they will need to understand what it was really like, not the sanitized version that masters will write in their histories. They will need to know about women like you, who were nearly murdered for the convenience of their owners. That knowledge, that truth, it has power." Abeni wanted to believe him, wanted to think that her suffering might someday mean something beyond her own pain. But in that moment, sitting in a dark cabin with rope burns still raw on her skin, the future seemed impossibly distant and uncertain. The following Sunday, Reverend Blackwood devoted his sermon to the topic of false accusations and the importance of careful judgment. He spoke at length about the 9th commandment against bearing false witness, about the need to seek truth rather than convenient scapegoats. But he did not mention Abeni by name, did not acknowledge how close the colony's leadership had come to committing judicial murder, did not question the system that made such injustice not only possible, but likely. After the service, which all slaves were required to attend, Abeni found herself standing near the church, watching the white colonists file past. Some glanced at her with curiosity or embarrassment, others ignored her completely. She was no longer interesting to them, the drama having passed, the spectacle denied. She had been reduced once again to background, to property that required no further thought or consideration. But as she turned to follow the other slaves back to the plantation, she caught sight of a young white woman watching her from across the churchyard. The woman was perhaps 20 years old, dressed simply with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most. She held a small journal in her hands, and as their eyes met, she gave Abeni the slightest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps respect. Abeni learned later that the woman was Sarah Bennett, the educated daughter of a minor planter who kept detailed records of life in the colony. Sarah had attended the attempted execution and had been horrified by what she witnessed. In her journal, she would write a detailed account of Abeni's ordeal, preserving it for posterity, even though she knew such writing was dangerous, that documenting the cruelty of the slave system could bring trouble to her own household. This small act of witnessing, of recording the truth, was more than most would offer. It was a fragile thread of connection between two women divided by everything their society valued, yet united by a shared recognition of injustice. The weeks following Abeni's near execution brought changes to the Whitmore plantation, subtle shifts in the social dynamics that revealed how deeply the incident had unsettled the carefully maintained order. The other slaves treated Abeni with a mixture of awe and superstitious fear, as if her survival of such a close brush with death had marked her as somehow special, perhaps even protected by forces they did not understand. Samuel tried to discourage such talk, reminding them that it was human intervention, not divine providence, that had saved her, but the whispers persisted. Master Whitmore became more erratic in his behavior, his authority having been undermined by his willingness to execute an innocent slave based on his wife's paranoid accusations. The other planters, while publicly supporting his actions, privately questioned his judgment. Robert Fielding was overheard at a gathering in Jamestown saying that Whitmore had lost his nerve and that a strong master would have proceeded with the execution regardless of Wade's testimony, arguing that maintaining discipline among the slaves was more important than absolute certainty of guilt. This attitude, that the appearance of control mattered more than actual justice, was widespread among the planter class. They were outnumbered by the people they enslaved and the indentured servants they exploited, and they knew that their position rested on terror and the constant demonstration of their willingness to use overwhelming violence. Mercy was viewed as weakness, and weakness could lead to rebellion. For Abeni, the trauma of what she had endured manifested in nightmares that jolted her awake night after night, her body drenched in sweat, her mind replaying the moment when Kempe's torch touched the kindling. She would wake gasping, convinced she could smell burning flesh, only to find herself still in the dark cabin with Samuel's gentle voice reassuring her that she was safe, that it was over. But was it over? Could it ever truly be over when the same system that had nearly killed her remained fully intact, when her life was still subject to the arbitrary whims of people who did not see her as human? 3 months after the incident, a new group of enslaved Africans arrived at the plantation, purchased by Master Whitmore from a ship that had recently docked at Jamestown. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all appearing shell-shocked and traumatized by their journey across the Atlantic. They spoke no English, only various African languages that even Samuel did not fully understand, and they looked upon their new surroundings with the glazed eyes of people who had seen too much horror to fully process. Abeni found herself in the position of helping to orient these new arrivals, teaching them basic English words, showing them how to avoid beatings, explaining the incomprehensible rules of this alien world. It was a role she had never imagined for herself, but one that felt important. If her survival had any meaning, perhaps it was in helping others to survive as well. One of the new women, whom the slaves called Ama, because they could not pronounce her full name, attached herself to Abeni with desperate intensity. She was younger, perhaps 16 or 17, and the Middle Passage had left her physically weakened and emotionally shattered. She would follow Abeni through the tobacco fields, watching her every movement, trying to learn not just survival skills, but how to maintain some core of self in a place designed to strip away all individuality. "You are strong," Amma said one evening, in halting, broken English that she was rapidly acquiring. "They tried to kill you, but you lived. You must have powerful spirits protecting you." "No spirits," Abeni replied, though she appreciated the girl's faith. "Just luck. Just one man who spoke the truth at the right moment." "Then we need more men who speak truth," Amma said with the simple wisdom of someone who had seen the world's cruelty unmasked. The relationship between Abeni and Amma became a source of both comfort and concern to the other slaves. Comfort because it demonstrated that bonds of humanity could survive even the most brutal oppression. that care and compassion could exist in a world built on their absence. Concern because such attachments made them vulnerable, gave them something that could be used against them, that could be weaponized by masters who understood that the most effective control came from threatening what people loved. This fear was not unfounded. In November of 1619, as harvest season reached its peak, Master Whitmore made a decision that would shatter the fragile peace that had settled over the plantation. He had accumulated debt purchasing the new slaves and needed to raise capital quickly. His solution was to sell 2 of his enslaved workers to a planter in Maryland, and he chose Samuel and Amma as the ones who would be sent away. The announcement came without warning on a cold morning when frost covered the tobacco plants like a shroud. Whitmore called the slaves together and informed them of his decision with the casual tone of someone discussing livestock. Samuel and Amma would be leaving within the week, sold to a man named William Claiborne, who operated a plantation on Kent Island in the Chesapeake Bay. Abaney felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Samuel, who had become her teacher, her protector, her link to sanity in this nightmare, and Amma, the young woman she had been helping to heal, who relied on her guidance and presence. Both were being torn away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, the slave cabin was filled with a grief so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Samuel sat in the corner, his weathered face streaked with tears he made no effort to hide. Amma had collapsed into Abaney's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her despair. "I cannot do this again," Amma choked out between sobs. "I cannot be torn from everyone I care about again. I cannot." Abaney held her, rocking her gently, searching for words of comfort that did not exist. What could she say? That it would be all right, that they would see each other again. Such lies would be cruel in their false hope. Samuel spoke into the darkness, his voice heavy with a lifetime of accumulated sorrow. "This is what they do to us. They break every bond, sever every connection, ensure that we can never build anything lasting. Because if we had families, if we had communities, we would be stronger, we would be harder to control. We should run," one of the other slaves, a young man named Joseph, said suddenly. "Samuel and Amma should escape before the sale, head north, find freedom." "There is no freedom north," Samuel replied wearily. "Not for us, not anywhere in these colonies. And the punishment for running is death, or worse. They would make an example of us that would haunt this plantation for years." "Then we are truly helpless," Joseph said, his voice breaking. "We can only watch as they destroy us piece by piece." The hopelessness in the cabin was suffocating. Abaney felt it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Everything Samuel had told her about bearing witness, about her survival having meaning, seemed hollow now. What was the point of surviving if you had to watch everyone you cared about be torn away? But then, in that moment of deepest despair, Abaney had an idea. It was desperate and risky, but it was something, a way to at least try to resist, to assert some small measure of agency. "Sarah Bennett," she said suddenly, sitting up straighter, "the woman who was at the church, who keeps journals. If we could get word to her, if she could record what is happening, bear witness to these separations, maybe someday it would matter, maybe someday someone would care." "What good would that do?" Joseph asked bitterly. "White people writing about our suffering, they already know. They choose not to care." "But she is different," Abaney insisted, though she barely knew the woman. "I saw it in her eyes. She sees us as human, and if there is even a chance that our stories might survive, might be remembered as something other than the lies masters tell, is it not worth trying?" Samuel looked at her with something like pride. "You are thinking like a survivor, child. Not just enduring, but fighting back in the only way available to us. Yes, we should try to reach her." Over the next few days, while preparations for the sale proceeded with brutal efficiency, Abaney worked on composing a message to Sarah Bennett. She could not write, but Samuel could, having been taught by a previous master who had believed in educating his slaves before the practice became legally prohibited. Together, they crafted a simple but powerful statement about the separation that was about to occur, about the human cost of treating people as property. The challenge was getting the message to Sarah. The Bennett plantation was 5 miles away, and slaves were not permitted to leave their assigned property without passes, which Whitmore would never grant for such a purpose. But there was a network of communication between plantations, informal and largely invisible to the white population, that allowed information to flow despite the restrictions. A free black man named Caesar, who sold fish to various plantations and was therefore permitted to travel freely, agreed to carry the message. He was taking an enormous risk, as being caught facilitating communication between slaves could result in the loss of his precious freedom, but he did it anyway, part of a quiet resistance that ran through the black community like an underground river. 3 days before Samuel and Amma were to be sold, Caesar delivered a response from Sarah Bennett. She had received the message and was moved by it. She promised to record everything she learned about the sale and the separation, to preserve it in her journal, along with the account of Abeni's near execution. She could not stop what was happening, she wrote, but she could bear witness to it, could ensure that the truth was preserved for a future that might possibly care. It was a small thing, pathetically small in the face of such immense injustice. But it was something. It was a refusal to let the suffering be erased, be forgotten, be reduced to nothing more than entries in a ledger book. On the morning of the sale, a cold rain fell across the plantation, turning the ground to mud and making the day feel even more miserable than it already was. William Claiborne arrived with 2 assistants and a wagon, ready to transport his new property back to Maryland. He was a man in his 50s, with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, having served as the Secretary and Surveyor General of the Virginia colony before focusing on his own commercial ventures. The transaction was conducted on the porch of the main house, with Master Whitmore and Claiborne haggling over price as if they were discussing horses or farm equipment. Samuel stood in the rain with his head bowed, his dignity intact despite the degradation of being sold. Emma was barely holding herself together, her body trembling violently, though whether from cold or anguish was impossible to determine. His face, trying to commit every detail to memory, this man who had been like a father to her in this terrible place. She saw the moment when money changed hands, when ownership transferred, when 2 human lives became the property of a different master. Before they were loaded into the wagon, Samuel managed to catch Abeni's eye across the muddy yard. He mouthed words she could not hear but understood perfectly. Remember, bear witness, survive. Then he and Amma were gone, the wagon disappearing down the road that led toward the Chesapeake, taking with it 2 more pieces of Abeni's heart. She stood in the rain long after they had vanished from sight, letting the cold water wash over her, mix with her tears, carry away nothing of her grief. The plantation felt emptier after their departure, haunted by absences that were never acknowledged by the white inhabitants. Life simply continued, as if Samuel and Amma had never existed, as if their forced separation was merely routine business, unremarkable and certainly not worthy of comment or reflection. But Abeni did not forget. She could not forget. And she knew that somewhere Sarah Bennett was writing it all down, preserving their names and their stories in ink that would outlast the lies of the masters. It was a small resistance, but it was resistance nonetheless. In the months that followed, Abeni began to understand something fundamental about survival under slavery. It was not just about enduring from day to day, though. That was part of it. It was also about maintaining connections to your own humanity, about refusing to internalize the dehumanization that surrounded you, about finding ways to resist even when resistance seemed impossible. She started teaching the other slaves what Samuel had taught her, passing on his wisdom, his stories, his knowledge. She learned songs from the new African arrivals and taught them English, creating bridges between their lost homeland and this brutal present. She found ways to slow her work pace without being caught, small acts of sabotage that cost the masters profit while keeping her safe from punishment. And she talked. Whenever Caesar the fishmonger came by, she would give him information to pass to Sarah Bennet, small details about life on the plantation, about the suffering and the small joys, about the ways enslaved people maintained their dignity despite everything. These accounts would become part of Sarah's ever-growing journal, a secret chronicle of truth that contradicted the official narratives being constructed by the colonial leadership. One day in early spring of 1620, as Abeni worked in the tobacco fields under a sky of impossible blue, she noticed a change in Mistress Catherine. The woman emerged from the house and walked toward the fields, something she rarely did, and when she reached Abeni, her face was transformed by genuine joy. "I am with child again," Catherine said, her voice trembling with emotion. "The midwife confirmed it this morning. After everything that happened, after all the darkness, there is new life." Abeni straightened from her work, unsure how to respond. She was expected to show happiness for her mistress, to celebrate this news, but the words caught in her throat. This woman had tried to have her burned alive, and now she was meant to rejoice in her good fortune. But as she looked at Catherine's face, she saw not just joy, but also fear, a desperate hope that this pregnancy would succeed where the last had failed, that she could somehow redeem herself through successful motherhood. And Abeni realized that Catherine too was trapped, in different ways, but trapped nonetheless by a society that reduced women to their reproductive capacity and judged their worth by their ability to produce heirs. "I hope all goes well for you, mistress," Abeni finally said, and she meant it not because Catherine deserved her goodwill, but because she refused to let hatred consume her, refused to become as cruel as those who had tried to destroy her. Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. And Abeni, I want you to know, I have asked my husband to make provisions in his will. If anything should happen to him, you are to be freed. It is the least I can do, though I know it can never make amends for what I did." The promise hung in the air between them, substantial and yet insubstantial. Wills could be changed, and even if Master Whitmore died, there was no guarantee his heirs would honor such provisions. Freedom promised by a guilty conscience was fragile at best, but Abeni nodded acceptance. "I appreciate the gesture, mistress." As Catherine walked back to the house, John Kempe appeared beside Abeni, his face twisted with resentment. The overseer had been stripped of some of his authority after the incident with Jenny Marsh, as his poor judgment in spurning the servant girl had contributed to the chain of events that nearly resulted in wrongful execution. "Don't get your hopes up, girl," he sneered. "Master Whitmore's a young man, like to live for decades yet, and even if he does die, ain't no guarantee you'll see freedom. Promises to slaves are worth less than pig shit." Abeni did not respond, simply returned to her work. Kempe's bitterness was his own burden to carry. She had learned that engaging with such hatred only fed it, gave it power it did not deserve. That evening, as the sun set in shades of orange and purple that painted the sky like a masterpiece, Abeni sat outside the slave cabin and thought about everything that had happened since that terrible day when she had been dragged before Master Whitmore and accused of witchcraft. She had survived her own execution, had watched people she loved be torn away, had witnessed cruelty and occasional kindness, had navigated a world designed to crush her spirit, and yet, here she was, still alive. Still herself, still capable of feeling, of caring, of hoping despite all evidence that hope was foolish. Joseph emerged from the cabin and sat beside her. The young man had become more thoughtful since Samuel's departure, less impulsive, more aware of the complexity of their situation. "You ever think about running?" he asked quietly, knowing such talk was dangerous even among themselves. "Every day," Abeni admitted. "But where would I go? North to the Dutch territories where slavery is different but still exists, west into lands controlled by Indians who have no reason to help me. The ocean that brought me here is impassable without ships I cannot access. I am trapped not just by chains, but by geography. So we just accept it? Accept that this is our life until we die? Abeni shook her head. Acceptance and survival are not the same thing. I will never accept that this is right, that I deserve this, that any of us deserve this. But I will survive, and I will make sure our stories survive too. That is my resistance. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Samuel would be proud of you. You have become what he was, a keeper of memory, a witness to truth. The responsibility felt heavy, but also purposeful. If her life was to have meaning beyond mere endurance, perhaps this was it. To remember, to record through Sarah Bennett's pen, to ensure that future generations would know what really happened in these early days of American slavery, unvarnished by the myths that masters would construct. The autumn of 1620 brought significant changes to the Virginia colony, ripples of transformation that would affect even the smallest plantations. Ships arrived bearing new colonists, including women specifically recruited to become wives for the male settlers, part of the Virginia Company's effort to create a stable, permanent society rather than a temporary profit extraction operation. The Pilgrims landed far to the north at Plymouth, establishing a separate English colony that would develop its own relationship with slavery and indigenous peoples. For Bani, now in her third year of bondage in Virginia, these larger historical currents were distant abstractions. Her world remained bounded by the Whitmore plantation's acres, by the endless labor of tobacco cultivation, by the daily navigation of a system designed to break her. But she had learned to find moments of peace within the horror, small spaces where her spirit could breathe. Sarah Bennett had become an unlikely but crucial ally. Through Caesar's discreet message-carrying, the two women had developed a kind of correspondence, with Sarah asking questions about Abeni's experiences and Abeni providing answers that were then recorded in the growing journal. Sarah had also begun documenting other aspects of slave life throughout the region, interviewing free blacks when possible, observing the treatment of the enslaved, creating a record that contradicted the sanitized accounts appearing in official colonial documents. In October, Sarah arranged to visit the Whitmore plantation under the pretense of discussing a potential business arrangement between her father and Master Whitmore. But her real purpose was to meet Abeni face-to-face for the first time since the near execution. They were able to speak briefly near the well, where Abeni was drawing water. Sarah's eyes held a fierce intelligence and a sadness that suggested she understood far more than most white colonists about the evil system she had been born into. "I have preserved your testimony," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every detail you have shared, every insight into what life is truly like for the enslaved. It is hidden, but it is safe. Someday, perhaps long after we are both gone, someone will find it and know the truth." "Why do you do this?" Abeni asked, genuinely curious. "You risk your reputation, possibly your safety, to record the suffering of people your society says are not even human. What drives you to such dangerous work?" Sarah's expression was troubled. "I have asked myself that many times. Perhaps it is because I see the hypocrisy so clearly. These men who speak of liberty and rights, who fled England to escape what they perceived as tyranny, have created here something far worse. They speak of building a city on a hill, a beacon of righteousness, but they build it on the backs of stolen people. I cannot participate in that lie without at least trying to preserve the truth." "You give me hope," Abeni admitted. "Not hope for freedom. I am not so foolish as to believe that likely, but hope that we will be remembered, that our suffering will not be erased and forgotten." "You will be remembered," Sarah promised. "I swear it." Their conversation was cut short by the approach of Kempe, who eyed Sarah with suspicion but could not question a white woman of property without cause. Sarah returned to the main house, and Abeni went back to her work, but something had shifted. The act of being truly seen, truly heard by someone outside the enslaved community had validated her existence in a way she had not realized she needed. That winter was particularly harsh, with snow falling more heavily than usual and temperatures dropping so low that the James River partially froze. The slave cabin was inadequate shelter against such cold, with gaps between the logs wide enough to let in wind and snow. The enslaved workers huddled together for warmth, sharing what little body heat they could generate, trying to survive nights that felt endless. It was during this brutal winter that Mistress Catherine gave birth to a healthy son, whom she named Richard after his father. The joy in the main house was palpable, but it was tinged with anxiety. Infant mortality was extremely high in the colony, and Catherine had already lost one child. She became obsessively protective of the baby, barely letting him out of her sight, sleeping little as she constantly checked to ensure he was still breathing. And in a development that surprised everyone, Catherine requested that Abeni be brought into the house to help care for the infant. Master Whitmore was initially opposed, given the history between his wife and the slave, but Catherine insisted with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "She has suffered because of me," Catherine argued, her voice carrying through the house where Abeni stood outside, able to hear every word. "Allowing her this position, giving her easier work, it is small recompense, but it is something, and I trust her. I know that sounds strange after everything, but I do. She has every reason to hate us, yet she has shown no malice." So Abeni found herself in the unprecedented position of working in the main house, caring for the infant Richard during the day, while Catherine rested or attended to other duties. It was easier work than the fields, warmer and less physically demanding, but it came with its own complications. Being in close proximity to the white family meant witnessing their private moments, their conflicts and vulnerabilities. She heard Master Whitmore arguing with his wife about money, about his struggles to achieve the wealth and status he believed he deserved. She saw Catherine's lingering melancholy, the way she stared at her baby with equal parts love and terror, convinced that at any moment he might be taken from her. And she cared for the infant, this small human who knew nothing of slavery or freedom, who simply wanted to be fed and held and comforted. It was impossible not to develop feelings for the child, impossible not to see him as innocent of the sins of his parents. But it was also impossible to forget that this baby, if he survived to adulthood, would likely become a slaveholder himself, would inherit his father's property, including whatever enslaved people still remained. One afternoon in early spring, while Catherine napped and the baby slept in his cradle, Abeni found herself alone in the house for the first time. She moved quietly through the rooms, looking at the objects that marked this family's status, the few pieces of imported furniture, the pewter dishes, the Bible prominently displayed, the documents and letters that recorded Master Whitmore's business dealings. And there, on the desk in the small office where Whitmore conducted his affairs, she saw it, his will, left out carelessly, perhaps reviewed recently. Unable to read well, but able to recognize her own name, she scanned the document, searching for the provision Catherine had mentioned about her freedom. It was not there. There was no mention of freeing Abeni upon Master Whitmore's death. Either Catherine had lied, or she had been unable to convince her husband to include such a provision, or he had removed it after initially agreeing. Whatever the reason, the promise of future freedom was as insubstantial as morning mist. Abeni carefully replaced the will, exactly as she had found it, and stepped away from the desk, her heart heavy but not surprised. She had known better than to truly believe in such promises. Freedom was not something that would be given to her. If it came at all, it would have to be taken or created through circumstances she could not yet imagine. That evening, she spoke with the other slaves about what she had learned working in the house, the financial pressures Master Whitmore faced, the tensions between him and other planters, the constant fear that animated the white colonists' lives despite their position of power. Knowledge was a form of power too, limited but real, and sharing what she learned was another form of resistance. Caesar the fishmonger visited the next day, and Abeni passed along information for Sarah Bennet, including details about her new role in the house and what she was observing about the White family's private lives. She knew Sarah would use this material carefully, would understand both its historical value and its dangerous nature. As spring progressed and the tobacco planting season began again, Abeni found herself in an unusual position, working part of the time in the fields and part of the time in the house, moving between two worlds that normally remained completely separate. The other slaves treated her with a mixture of envy and suspicion, worried that her proximity to the masters might have corrupted her loyalty to her own people. Joseph confronted her about it one evening, his voice harsh with accusation. "You are becoming too comfortable in that house, playing nurse to the master's child. You are forgetting who you are, where you belong." Abeni felt anger flash through her, hot and immediate. "I forget nothing. I am exactly where I've always been, enslaved and powerless. The fact that my labor now includes caring for an infant instead of just pulling weeds does not change my status. And the knowledge I gain in that house, the secrets I learn, those are valuable. Do not presume to judge me for surviving in whatever way I can." The confrontation revealed the tensions that slavery created even within the enslaved community. The way the system pitted people against each other, made solidarity difficult, turned potential allies into competitors or critics. It was yet another layer of cruelty, another way the masters maintained control by ensuring that those they oppressed could never fully unite. But despite the tensions, the core group of slaves on the Whitmore plantation maintained connections, continued to support each other when possible, continued to share information and resources within the strict limits of what was possible. They sang together in the evenings when they were permitted, songs that preserved African melodies even as they adapted to English words, songs that maintained cultural memory despite the systematic attempts to erase it. In June of 1621, news reached the plantation that sent ripples of fear through the enslaved community. A slave on a nearby plantation had been executed for attempting to poison his master's family. The method of execution had been particularly brutal, designed to terrorize others into submission. The man had been burned alive, just as Abeni would have been if not for Thomas Wade's intervention. The news brought Abeni's trauma flooding back, the nightmares returning with renewed intensity. She would wake gasping, convinced she could smell smoke, could feel flames licking at her skin. Catherine noticed her distress and, in a rare gesture of genuine compassion, allowed Abeni to sleep in a small room off the kitchen rather than return to the slave cabin for several nights, recognizing that the proximity of others sleeping nearby helped calm her fears. It was during one of these nights that Abeni overheard a conversation between Master Whitmore and a visiting planter named George Harrison. They were discussing the executed slave, and their words revealed much about the thinking of the planter class. "The problem is that we are becoming too dependent on these Africans," Harrison said, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "They outnumber us, and they have no loyalty to us. Every slave is a potential threat. What choice do we have?" Whitmore responded. "The tobacco demands labor that English servants cannot or will not provide in sufficient quantities. And the Africans, being heathens, can be held permanently rather than just for terms of indenture." "Then we must be vigilant," Harrison insisted. "We must make examples of any who step out of line, use terror to keep them submissive. That burning, brutal as it was, serves a necessary purpose." It reminds them all of what awaits should they dare to resist. Abeni listened to this cold-blooded discussion of using murder as a tool of social control and understood more clearly than ever that there was no reasoning with such people, no appealing to mercy or justice. They had convinced themselves that slavery was not just economically necessary, but morally justified, that their victims were less than human and therefore deserved whatever cruelty was inflicted upon them. The next morning, she found a way to pass this information to Sarah through Caesar, knowing that documenting such conversations was important, that preserving the words of the masters, as well as the experiences of the enslaved, would create a more complete historical record. Sarah's response, delivered a week later, was brief but powerful. Your courage in bearing witness, in surviving day after day while maintaining your humanity and your commitment to truth, is extraordinary. Do not underestimate what you are doing. You are creating a record that will outlive all of us, that will someday force people to confront the reality of what is being built here. That is no small thing. The summer of 1621 brought news that would reshape the Virginia colony's relationship with its indigenous neighbors. The Powhatan Confederacy, which had maintained an uneasy peace with the English settlers since the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe, was fracturing. The death of Pocahontas in England years earlier had removed a crucial diplomatic bridge, and her father, Chief Powhatan, had also died, leaving leadership to Opechancanough, who was far less inclined toward accommodation with the encroaching settlers. The growing tensions between English colonists and indigenous peoples added another layer of anxiety to plantation life. The Whitmore property, relatively isolated and bordered by wilderness, felt particularly vulnerable. Master Whitmore increased patrols and began fortifying the main house, actions that required additional labor from the already overworked slaves. For Abeni, these developments were viewed through a complex lens. The Powhatan people had their own forms of slavery and had sometimes participated in the capture and sale of enslaved Africans to the English. But they also represented the possibility of disrupting the colonial system that oppressed her. If war came, it might create opportunities for escape or resistance that did not currently exist. These thoughts remained largely private, shared only in whispered conversations with trusted others. But they represented a shift in Abeni's thinking, from pure survival to consideration of more active resistance. The trauma of her near execution had marked her, but it had also hardened her, made her less afraid of risks, more willing to imagine possibilities beyond simple endurance. In August, Mistress Catherine's health began to decline. She had never fully recovered from childbirth, and now she developed a persistent cough that grew progressively worse. The colonial surgeon was summoned, but his treatments, bloodletting and various tonics, seemed to weaken her further. As she deteriorated, she became more reflective, more aware of her mortality. One afternoon, while Abeni was caring for the baby, Catherine called her to sit by her bedside. The mistress's face was pale, her breathing labored, her eyes fever-bright. "I am dying," Catherine said bluntly, stating what everyone knew but no one would say aloud. "I can feel it. And before I go, I need to tell you something, need to try once more to make amends for what I did to you." "Mistress, you should rest," Abeni began, but Catherine waved her hand weakly, demanding silence. "No, let me speak while I still can. What I did to you, accusing you falsely, nearly having you killed, it was the worst thing I've ever done. I was mad with grief and fear, but that is no excuse. You were innocent, and I tried to murder you to make myself feel better, to give my pain a target." "I know," Abeni said quietly. "I forgave you long ago, not because you deserved it, but because carrying hatred was destroying me from within." Catherine's tears flowed freely now. "You are a better person than I ever was. And I want you to know, I tried to convince Richard to free you in his will. I begged him, but he refused, said it would set a dangerous precedent that other slaves would expect the same. He values his standing among the other planters more than he values justice. I saw the will, Abeni admitted. I know there is no provision for my freedom. Then you know my words were empty, Catherine said, her voice breaking. But I want you to have something real, something tangible. She reached under her pillow with trembling hands and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. This is my diary, kept since I arrived in Virginia. It contains everything, all my thoughts, my fears, my guilt over what I did to you. Take it, hide it. Someday, when you find freedom, and I believe you will, though I will not live to see it, this journal will prove your innocence, will document what really happened. Abeni took the journal with shaking hands, understanding the enormous risk Catherine was taking in giving her such a document. If Master Whitmore found it in her possession, it would likely mean severe punishment or death. Why? Abeni asked. Why give this to me now? Because I cannot take it with me where I am going, Catherine replied with a wan smile. And because your life matters, your story matters. I failed to save you from the stake, but perhaps I can give you something that will help others understand what happened here, what is still happening. Promise me you will keep it safe, that you will ensure the truth survives. I promise, Abeni said, and she meant it, adding this journal to the growing archive of truth that was slowly being assembled through her correspondence with Sarah Bennet. Catherine died 3 days later, her passing mourned by Master Whitmore more for its inconvenience than from genuine grief. He now had an infant son to raise and no wife to manage the household, problems that required solutions. Within weeks, he was negotiating with the Virginia Company for another bride, viewing women as interchangeable as any other resource needed for plantation management. Abeni continued caring for young Richard, the baby now 7 months old and beginning to show his own personality. She found herself conflicted about her feelings for the child. He was innocent, blameless for the circumstances of his birth, yet he represented everything she should hate. He would grow up to inherit his father's property, including any slaves still living, would likely perpetuate the same system that had nearly killed her. But for now, he was just a baby who needed feeding and comfort, and she could not bring herself to withhold care simply because of what he might become. Perhaps that was weakness, or perhaps it was the last vestige of her humanity, her refusal to let the masters turn her into something as heartless as they were. The journal Catherine had given her was hidden carefully in the slave cabin, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath the dirt floor where no casual search would find it. Combined with the information she had been sharing with Sarah Bennet, it formed a substantial record of slavery's reality, unvarnished by the propaganda that was already being constructed to justify the institution. In October, Caesar brought devastating news. Sarah Bennet had died suddenly of fever, a common fate in the disease-ridden colony where European immune systems struggled against New World pathogens. She had been only 22 years old, and her journal, the comprehensive record she had been building of slavery's horrors, had been burned by her father, who discovered it after her death and was horrified by its contents. He feared that such writings could damage his family's reputation and business interests. The news hit Abeni like a physical blow. Sarah had been her voice to the future, her connection to the possibility that truth might someday matter. Now Sarah was gone, her journal destroyed, and once again Abeni felt the weight of erasure, the terrifying possibility that all the suffering would be forgotten, reduced to nothing more than property transactions in ledger books. But she still had Catherine's journal, she still had her own memories, and she still had her voice, limited though its reach might be. She would continue bearing witness, continue telling her story to anyone who would listen, continue insisting on her own humanity in a world determined to deny it. As 1621 drew to a close and she entered her 4th year of slavery, Abeni had survived impossibilities. She had been within moments of being burned alive and had been saved by an unlikely intervention. She had watched people she loved be sold away and had maintained her sanity despite isolation and trauma. She had found ways to resist that did not result in immediate death, small acts of defiance and preservation that added up to something meaningful. The system was designed to break her, and in many ways, it had succeeded. She was not the same person who had been captured in Africa. That young woman, free and full of dreams, was gone forever, destroyed by the Middle Passage and years of bondage. But in her place was someone harder, wiser, more resilient. Someone who understood that survival was not just physical, but also psychological and spiritual, that maintaining one's humanity in the face of dehumanization was its own form of victory. In March of 1622, the event that colonists had feared finally occurred. Opechancanough launched a coordinated attack across multiple English settlements, killing approximately 347 colonists in a single day. The Whitmore plantation, being more isolated, was not attacked directly, but the aftermath was chaotic and terrifying. The colony went into lockdown, with all plantations fortifying their positions and preparing for prolonged conflict. For the enslaved population, the war between colonists and indigenous peoples created new dangers, but also new possibilities. Some slaves escaped during the chaos, disappearing into the wilderness with uncertain fates. Others were killed when settlements were attacked, their deaths unremarked and unmourned. The rigid control that masters had maintained over their human property loosened slightly in the face of larger threats. Abeni did not attempt to escape, calculating that the risks outweighed the potential benefits, but she watched, learned, gathered information, and continued to survive. She cared for young Richard, who was now over a year old and beginning to walk and speak. She worked in the fields when needed and in the house when required. She maintained connections with the other slaves, shared what resources she could, and kept Catherine's journal hidden and safe. And she waited. For what, she was not entirely sure. For freedom that might never come, for justice that seemed impossible, for a future where her story might matter, where someone might care that she had existed, had suffered, had survived against all odds. Years would pass. Master Whitmore would eventually remarry a young woman named Elizabeth, who arrived from England in 1623. More slaves would be purchased as the plantation expanded. Some would die of disease or overwork. Others would be sold away. A few would escape or rebel and face brutal consequences. The cycle of suffering would continue, year after year, generation after generation. But through it all, Abeni would endure. She would grow older, her body bearing the marks of hard labor, her face showing the weight of accumulated sorrow. She would never see freedom in her lifetime, would never return to Africa, would never know the life that should have been hers. But she would survive. She would bear witness. She would ensure that at least one voice told the truth about what had happened in these early years of American slavery, before the myths took hold, before the lies became accepted history. Decades later, when she was an old woman still enslaved on the same plantation where she had nearly been burned at the stake, Abeni would tell her story to the younger slaves, ensuring that the memory of what had happened was passed down. She would show them Catherine's journal, teach them why documentation mattered, why truth-telling was a form of resistance. And though she could not know it, her insistence on bearing witness would eventually matter. Catherine's journal would be discovered by historians centuries later, providing rare first-person testimony about the realities of early colonial slavery. Combined with scattered records and the oral traditions Abeni had helped maintain, it would contribute to a more complete understanding of this dark chapter in American history. The story of Abeni, the woman who was nearly sacrificed for witchcraft by her accusers in Virginia, who survived against impossible odds, who insisted on her humanity when everyone around her denied it, would eventually be told. Not in her lifetime, not even in the lifetimes of those who knew her directly. But eventually, the truth would emerge from the deliberate forgetting, from the carefully constructed lies, from the willful ignorance of generations who preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable realities. She had been enslaved, brutalized, nearly murdered by people who claimed to be building a Christian society, but she had not been destroyed. Her spirit, her voice, her insistence on truth had survived. And that survival, that refusal to be erased, was its own form of victory, small and bittersweet but real. As the sun set on another day in the Virginia colony, Abeni stood in the doorway of the slave cabin and looked out at the land that had been stolen from indigenous peoples and worked by stolen Africans. She thought of Samuel and Amma, wondering if they were still alive somewhere in Maryland. She thought of Sarah Bennett, who had tried to preserve the truth, but whose work had been destroyed. She thought of her mother in Africa, whom she would never see again, and she thought of the future, that distant, unknowable time when perhaps people would look back and understand what had really happened here, who had truly built this nation, at what cost, through what suffering. She thought of future generations who might read Catherine's journal or hear the stories passed down through the enslaved community, and finally understand. That hope, fragile and uncertain, was enough to keep her standing, to keep her surviving, to keep her bearing witness one more day.